Please be warned, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and atrocities against people, which may be alarming to some listeners.
The latrines were the worst thing in the camp. The most abject place, the most degrading, where we were treated worse than animals, which is what the Germans themselves wanted. There are no words to describe the things that happened there. You had to go to the toilet. There was no way not to go there. The soup there it gave us was water, and every one of us had a need to go to the latrines. That was the place I felt the greatest humiliation. You had to relieve yourself very quickly each time. If one of the women needed a little more time, then she risked a beating. The block supervisors screamed, struck people, and hurried them up for the next group of women already waiting in line. That was what it was like every morning before going to work. Everything had to be done with haste.
Hello and welcome back to episode 3. Today we're going to be discussing the 18th of January. It's a slightly bit of a long one and we'll explain to you a little bit later why. You just heard the testimony of Ida Greenspan. She was a French Jewish girl who arrived at Auschwitz and she received number 75360. Today we're going to start with the advancing Soviet front with Chris.
Yeah, there's not much happening on this specific day other than the main struggle for Krakow, and the Russians are already starting to think about moving on once the city has fallen, mainly towards the Silesian industrial heartlands, because they're hoping that if they can take those, it would seriously dent German war production, and also they know that that's where the Germans are going to naturally fall back to as well, because they want to try and hold them. They're hoping to catch about 10 to 12 German divisions, which, like I said in the first episode, they're not fully numbered divisions. They're pretty much depleted after all the actions on the Eastern Front, and most of the divisions are made out of what are now called like action groups. So whoever the commander is and whatever units he's managed to pull together into a unit are now named after him. So you'd have like Schwarzgruppe or something, and they usually number between 500 to 1,500 men, so they're not large amounts of men blocking them anymore. And as they're moving forward, the Russians are starting to capture different areas. And in fact, they liberate on this day Neudach subcamp, which I will come to later. With the Soviets getting a lot closer, Kate, does that mean that the Germans are starting to step up evacuations, especially like in the medical areas?
Yeah, definitely. So come the 18th of January, doctors and nurses from the B2F part of the camp, so the camp's divided into various sections, move to B2D, a different section of the camp, and they take 150 sick prisoners that they have categorized as healthy to march. So basically they don't want to leave anyone behind. At 1 a.m., 40 prisoners were taken from the men's hospital in B2F in Birkenau. 40 prisoners, doctors and nurses, were joined by a column of prisoners who were awaiting the order to march out of the camp. The remaining doctors were then ordered to bring out the patient files, medical histories, fever charts, any documentation coming out of the offices in Camp B2F and destroy them. And this is overseen by SS men from the sanitary service. At noon, the doctors of the men's hospital, it's on the right-hand side of the camp, by the way, it's up at the top near Crematoria 3 in Birkenau, were ordered to draw up a list of the sick in each of the barracks and divide them into 3 categories. So these are the categories. We have those capable of a 50-kilometre march. Even the fittest person without training is going to struggle with that, aren't they? B, able to march 3 kilometres to the railway station in Auschwitz. And category C, unable to march. By 4 o'clock, 150 sick prisoners are deemed fit for the 50-kilometre march, and they leave the camp hospital. Now, this group also included prisoners who are unfit for such a long-distance march. Now, they were frightened, basically, of what was going to happen if they stayed behind. It was pretty much obvious that they were going to be eliminated if they stayed behind. Only the seriously ill and a small group of doctors and nurses remained behind in the camp.
It's pretty much a catch-22 situation here, though, isn't it? It's like, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you go, you have a chance of dying. If you stay, you have a chance of dying. How can somebody make such a decision?
It must be an awful decision to have to make. And also, you've made it to this point. You've made it to the point that they're evacuating the camp. You survived this long. And I wonder if these people who really weren't well enough to go on these marches were just clinging on to that hope that they might eventually be free. But yeah, what a desperate choice to have to make. So there's more evacuations happening in the camp that day, aren't there, Alina?
Yeah, today is the 18th. Today is the day where the official evacuation of women begins. So it's in the early morning part. We have the evacuation of the female prisoners from the Birkenau women's camp. So on the left-hand side, as you enter the camp, that whole section is now being evacuated. They're actually quite short intervals where columns of 500 women with children are being escorted by SS men. There's approximately 5,345 female prisoners that leave the camp on this day, and among them are also 176 women who were brought in from the Płaszów camp, the one just outside of Krakow, and from other sections of the camp, so not just the left-hand side, but you've also got women who are located on the right-hand side, and they're also being included in this transport. There's a testimony we have from Hella Adler, who remembers this specific evacuation, so we'll have a listen to what she's got to say.
On the 15th of January 1945, they sent us onto the road, destination unknown. They sent us out in open train cars. We traveled for 2 weeks. Snow fell and there was frost and it was cold. But we were dressed in our normal clothing with the sole exception that each of us received a blanket and a little bread for the road. At night the snow covered us and there was not even room for everyone to sleep. It was a transport entirely of women. They had all survived Hindenburg, with the exception of those few sick ones who were taken away. Things were very hard on the way. We were not allowed to get off the train and there was nothing to drink. We managed with food because from time to time they passed several loaves of bread into the train car. As for sleeping, it was very bad because for half the night some of us slept and the others stood because there was no room. After midnight, one part was woken up and we exchanged places. After 2 weeks, we arrived in Bergen-Belsen.
At the beginning of this podcast series, I talked about, I don't know if anybody remembers briefly, but there are about 40 subcamps. So not just Auschwitz, the main camp, Birkenau and Monowitz, there's other subcamps as well. And they're also being evacuated on this specific day. Not all of them. We're going to cover a couple tomorrow, but I thought it'd be quite interesting for us to be able to see what these subcamps are, what is the purpose of them, and what happens to the prisoners that are left behind. So we've split it up amongst each other and we'll talk about it now. So Kate, you're going to start off with Gleiwitz 1, aren't you?
So yes, I'm going to talk about Gleiwitz. There were actually 4 Gleiwitz subcamps. So we'll start with number 1. So this subcamp was founded in March of 1944, and it was at a rolling stock repair yard in Gleiwitz, in the town of Gleiwitz. The first several dozen prisoners transferred from Auschwitz were put to work assembling 7 wooden residential barrack blocks, a kitchen, hospital, storage area, and workshops. So on the sides facing the road and the rail tracks, the subcamp was actually screened off by a wall of concrete slabs topped with barbed wire. And on the other side, there was barbed wire strung on concrete posts, a little like you see at Auschwitz 1. So the prisoners were put to work doing various jobs, repairing damaged sides of cars in the machine shop, for example, or they might work in the smithy, they might be building roads or a nearby airstrip. They worked 2 shifts. There were 2 12-hour shifts. Some of the prisoners weren't given a particular work assignment, so they still needed to be punished and put to work. So they were given the rather pointless job of carrying stones from a nearby slag heap to the camp, and then they took them back again. So this really dehumanizing work. About 100 prisoners died at Gleiwitz 1 as a result of mistreatment, hunger, and backbreaking labor. We know at least 5 were shot while trying to escape, and 2 Russians were hanged for the same offense. The subcamp population just before evacuation in January 1945 was known to be 1,336 prisoners, comprising mostly of Jews, Poles, and Russians, and they were ordered to march on foot to Grossrosen. Before they set out, though, they took out selections, like they did in all of these places, to make sure the people who were leaving on foot were fit enough to do so. They selected several dozen sick, limping and exhausted prisoners, and instead of leaving them in the hospital to fester, the SS literally took them behind the barrack buildings and shot them. The remaining prisoners were told that on the way, if they couldn't keep up, they would be shot. On leaving the subcamp, they were given a loaf of bread each to get them through the march. Some of them were forced to drag carts with weapons or SS baggage in them, and weak prisoners were shot whilst marching through the woods. There was 3 days of solid marching, 2 nights spent in overcrowded and cold barns that they found along the way, and they eventually reached Bleichhammer subcamp, which was also in the process of being evacuated under escort by SS men. So some of the prisoners from Gleiwitz 1 managed to infiltrate themselves in with those existing prisoners and stayed at the subcamp at Bleichhammer and were able to avoid further evacuation. Some of them were killed when the SS just randomly fired on some prisoners' barracks, and a few managed to escape and get past the front line. On the 21st of January, the remaining Gleiwitz 1 prisoners were escorted to Grossrosen, where they arrived in the early days of February. And from there, they were sent in evacuation transports, in freight cars and cattle cars, to concentration camps of Buchenwald, Nordhausen, and Sachsenhausen. After the evacuation of prisoners, Gleiwitz Subcamp 1, like the others that I'm going to be discussing, 2, 3, and 4, became a place of temporary concentration for thousands of Auschwitz prisoners from other subcamps, and primarily from Monowitz itself.
So the next one up is Schrödinger, which is another relatively new subcamp. It's only been established in August 1944 at the Erdöl refinery for GmbH, and it replaces a camp again for British POWs. There'd been 200 there who had been sent to Lambsdorff POW camp. 300 men are placed in this barracks, and then another 300 2 weeks later, and then another 200 in mid-September. So where once there had only been 200 POWs, you're looking at more of about 1,000 Jewish prisoners. There's a total of 6 barracks in the end, 4 of which were made out of corrugated sheet metal to house the prisoners, so they're going to be quite cold. It's surrounded by an electrified barbed wire fence, hung on wooden posts, and it's under the command of SS Unterscharführer Wilhelm Kowal, with 60 SS men as guards at his disposal. And the prisoners, mostly Jews, are from Hungary and Poland, and they work on expanding the refinery by digging ditches, excavating foundations, laying pipes, installing sewage. Again, lots and lots of manual labour, as well as slightly more dangerous work. After an American air raid in August of 1944, they're used to not only sweep away and repair any rubble, but also dig up unexploded ordnance, which is incredibly dangerous. You've got the tightening of supervision and replacing of Jewish capos with German overseers because of the importance of the work. They need to make sure it's being done properly. And although management feel that these measures are yielding results, it's sort of suggested that they're not working hard enough as well. At the same time, in the face of the high death rate, the SS authorities have decided to install a Mazut-fired metal crematorium in the camp. And in January 1945, prisoners are being evacuated on foot to Rybnik, and from there by rail to Sachsenhausen and Bergen-Belsen. The prisoners of this subcamp are mostly evacuated. Those able to march were led to the main train camp, where those who could go no further were left behind. On reaching Rybnik, the surviving prisoners were loaded into, again, open freight wagons. After 4 days, they arrived frozen and at Grossrosen. The transports are not accepted because that camp is already overcrowded. So they're sent on to Sachsenhausen. And after 2 weeks to Bergen-Belsen, 2 Jewish prisoners, Anios Tauber, Abraham Piasecki, and a German Karl Brosio, managed to escape from the transport during the march. Those unable to march were taken to the railway siding at the refinery, loaded tightly into 4 coal wagons, over which there's like a makeshift roofs and taken off in an unknown direction.
Even though we've got loads of other subcamps that we can be talking about, I'm just going to finish off with Monovica. So this is the third camp in the large complex. So we have Auschwitz main camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Monovica. So Monovica is the third one. It's opened in November of 1943, and it's a industrial subcamp. And this is the site of the IG Farben factories. Basically, there was a Polish village there of Monovica, and it was built straight on top of that. The inhabitants were expelled, which happened quite a lot in these areas, and they razed all the buildings to the ground. Those buildings were then used to build other buildings for the camp complex. So there was about 2,000 prisoners brought there from Auschwitz I at the end of October of 1942. Then the population rose to about 6,000 in 43. And then by late summer, we've got nearly 11,000 people in this subcamp. Prisoners lived in 59 wooden barracks, and Chris, I can't remember which episode Chris talked about it, but I think it was last episode where you saw the factory and you could see the barracks and where they'd been damaged and things like that. So it's a really incredible piece of photography that you can see the whole camp complex and the 59 wooden barracks. Each of these barracks are furnished with 53 tier bunks, several tables and stools. Now, the conditions in this camp, they were better than Birkenau, and they ended up getting an extra serving of camp soup here specifically. That's because they needed those extra calories to be able to complete the hard labour, but it didn't really work because they died in droves here. They fell victim to selection. Selection was very rife in this specific camp. They would then be taken to Birkenau and murdered in the gas chambers. In total, we're talking about 1,670 prisoners alone were murdered here or in the hospital. And it was on the 18th of January, so on this day, where prisoners, mostly Jewish, were marched out towards Gleiwitz. They arrived there on the 20th. They spent 2 nights there, and then they were put into wagons and transported to Mattenhausen, Buchenwald, and Mittelbau-Dora. I want to quickly talk about escapes before I give you the testimony, and that is of Dan Arad, and he was a Polish Jew from Krakow. And a couple of days before the evacuation, he went to his friend who was in the clothing warehouse in Monovica, and he got himself some proper fitting warm clothing with what he states practically new high boots, and he began to scratch off the red paint off of his clothing. Now, issue here is if there weren't enough stripes that were provided to the prisoners, they were given civilian clothing with a red stripe, oil-based red stripe painted on the back of their clothing. So what he did is he began to scratch off this paint so he could easily blend in with the local population when he could escape. He sewed himself a rucksack from a blanket for food. He put it in a couple of boiled potatoes he managed to organise, a couple of loaves of bread, and a few sticks of margarine. Food was going to be one of the most important things. He noted that he didn't take water because he would have melted the snow on the way to be able to give him that water that he needed. And he noted very specifically that it was a beautiful sunny day. There were no clouds in the sky. It was the sky was very blue, but it was very cold on this day. The snow had melted and ice had covered over, which made it incredibly slippery for people who had wooden clogs and had no grip. Yet Dan had some form of good boots that helped him march. He became sweaty and hot during the march, which made him get rid of his blanket that he took with him. Then he had a coat on and he got rid of that as well. And he decided to not throw his rucksack with food. So even though he was tired, he was hot, he knew that not throwing his rucksack, that would have been a death sentence right there and then. So when they stopped to rest, 2 of his friends just made a run for it during the march, and he actually ended up successfully meeting up with them a few days later. He ended up in Gleiwitz. He and a couple of other prisoners saw that there were no guards on duty, and they basically just walked themselves out of the camp. And they began walking towards the Soviet army and then met up with his friends that made a run for it. It's such a story that we'll see a repetitiveness over and over again because so many people managed to escape. And Kate's going to talk about this in one of the next episodes, more about other people who had escaped their death marches. Let's have a listen to Józef Tarczyński's testimony and how he saw and what he felt during the evacuation process.
On the 18th of January, they began leading the prisoners out of the camp for the evacuation march. Before departure, they gave out dry provisions, bread and a little margarine. They led the prisoners out of the camp, 500 at a time. I left with the last group. SS men walked at the side, guarding the prisoners who marched in rows of 5. The SS men were armed with carbines and automatic rifles. Past Bieruń, we started passing the bodies of prisoners lying at the side of the road. These were the ones who had died from SS bullets, as they were incapable of marching further. From time to time, we could hear shots. Exhausted from the long march, we reached Gliwice. In Gliwice, the prisoners were placed in open coal cars, with about 60 people loading into each one. It was terribly crowded in the cars. None of the prisoners could move or change the position they were in. The train left Gliwice in the evening. Stopping frequently, we traveled very slowly. It is difficult for me now to describe exactly what started to happen during that train ride. Unprotected from the freezing temperatures, the prisoners grew weak. They were scenes out of Dante. Everyone fought for the space he occupied.
So we also have evacuations from Birkenau when the last functionary prisoners leave. So from time to time, columns of prisoners had left the Birkenau camp. On this particular afternoon, the last large group of around 2,000 people left section B2D. This included most of the functionary prisoners, the kitchen, the warehouse staff, and Soviet prisoners of war. They were issued food rations and again were directed to Gliwice. After they'd left, around 200 prisoners were remaining in B2D section, and they were led up to the main camp in the late afternoon. About half of those prisoners were men from the former Sonderkommando who'd been working, as we've discussed in recent weeks, to dismantle the crematoria, as well as some juvenile prisoners amongst their number. On the night of the 18th, 19th of January, they were joined by columns walking from the main camp along a route that was about 63 kilometres long. About 450 prisoners lost their lives on this particular death march, and about 3 escaped. We have the testimony of Zlama Dragan, who was a member of the Sonderkommando with his brother Abraham. He was sent off in the death march, and Zalma had to escape before it was too late. His fellow prisoners said he was very brave and that he would take the risks he needed to get away. He was constantly asked when he was to escape, was it time yet? He was so exhausted that he thought he would die like the others who had dropped dead in the snow or who were shot by the SS. But he decided he didn't want to die in this way, and he decided it was now time to run. He and his friend Henry Tauber walked off from the column down a path, and they weren't noticed, and quite remarkably, they were not shot at. Zalma had told his brother that he was leaving, and he had asked him to go with him when he left Birkenau, but his brother was too weak. And what makes his story so remarkable is that both of the men survived, and the brothers met again after the war. Parts of the main camp were also evacuated on the 18th of January. From time to time during the day, columns of 100 prisoners left the main camp. One of these columns consisted of civilian male and female prisoners from Block 11, the penal block, who were at the disposal of the summary court at the Katowice Gestapo. They came out surrounded by a strong convoy of SS men who were armed to the teeth with pistols and you name it. But even so, during this march, 11 people managed to escape the group. Thanks to the help of the people that they met along the way, they managed to get away from the column, the death march, and to wait the arrival and the liberation of Soviet soldiers. And that leads us nicely into the Soviets liberating Neuerdach, Chris.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to do a brief preamble as to what Neuerdach is. It's established 15th of June 1943 and placed under the command of SS Obersturmführer Bruno Fuze. Its main purpose is to mine coal at the Dasgruber, Rudolf Gruber and the Richard Gruber mines, and also to construct the Kraftwerk Wilhelm and expansions of the Kraftwerk Friedrich August power plants for Energieversorgung Oberschlesien AG. By January 17th, 1945, there's around about 3,664 prisoners at the camp, made up of mostly Jews from all across Europe, and it was the largest of the subcamps. There's a lot of physical backbreaking labour and very poor conditions. While as the front's getting closer, the camp is bombed by Soviet aircraft on the 15th of January. So on the 17th of January, the SS shot 40 of the weakest and sick before marching 3,200 of the surviving prisoners to Gross Rosen camp, which is about a distance of 250 kilometres. On the second night of the death march, 300 were shot. When they reached Gross Rosen, they find they moved along to Buchenwald much later, a few weeks later. Some of the 400 sick that were left behind in the camp were then liberated by the Armia Krajova on the 19th of January, and the Russians took over properly the following week. Interestingly, Funze ends up, after this evacuation, is transferred to Norway, where he becomes head of the SS Guard at a concentration camp there, and he's killed in May 1945.
Well, that's the end of episode 3 of the Auschwitz Liberation podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to support us further, then please consider joining our Patreon, where you find extra content the day after each episode is aired. Just head to patreon.com/moments_in_time. Or if you don't want to sign up, but fancy, donating a one-off payment to us, then you can do so at ko-fi.com/momentsinTime. Also, don't forget to rate us on your favourite listening platform. If that's Spotify or Apple, just head there and hit the 5-star button. Thank you again, and see you all tomorrow on the 19th for episode 4.
Thank you.